December 10, 1941. 22,000 feet above Luzon, Philippines. Captain Colin Kelly's lone B-17C Flying Fortress lumbered through clear skies, having just bombed what his crew believed was a Japanese battleship. They felt confident. The bomber's 4 Wright Cyclone engines hummed reassuringly, and intelligence claimed Japanese fighters couldn't reach their altitude. Then Saburō Sakai appeared. The 25-year-old Zero pilot, destined to become Japan's legendary ace with 64 kills, led his flight toward the massive American bomber. His initial reaction, recorded in his memoir, was almost dismissive. It looked enormous, clumsy, a 4-engine beast that moved through the sky like a warehouse with wings. We called it Yon-Hatsu Kemono. I thought destroying it would be simple. Sakai dove in for his attack run. Then the B-17's gunners opened fire. 13.50 caliber machine guns, each spitting 800 rounds per minute, created a cone of steel that Sakai had never encountered. His Zero took hits immediately. He broke off, wounded, aircraft damaged, having gained a newfound respect for American bombers. Before we reveal why attacking a B-17 became a death sentence, obliterate that subscribe button. Like and comment if defensive firepower terrifies you. This channel exposes flying fortresses that fought back. Now let me show you why Japan's best pilots learned to fear the slow American bomber. The B-17's nickname, Flying Fortress, originated not from combat experience but from a journalist's hyperbole at the 1935 rollout ceremony. Richard Williams of the Seattle Times coined the phrase when he saw the prototype bristling with 5 machine gun positions. Boeing loved the marketing value and trademarked it immediately. But in 1941, when war actually arrived, Japanese pilots examining intelligence photographs of the B-17 saw something very different from a fortress. They saw a target. The early B-17C and D models that equipped American forces in the Philippines carried only 5.50 caliber machine guns, 1 in the nose, 1 dorsal, 1 ventral, and 1 in each waist position. To Japanese fighter pilots accustomed to attacking lightly armed British and Dutch bombers over Southeast Asia, this seemed adequate but not intimidating. The Zero fighter, mounting 2 20mm cannons and 2 7.7mm machine guns, could theoretically shred a B-17 with a sustained burst into critical areas. Japanese tactical doctrine emphasized aggressive head-on attacks that overwhelmed bomber defenses through speed and violence. Lieutenant Masaharu Nakao, flying with the Tainan Air Group, described his first encounter with B-17s on December 10, 1941, in terms that mixed confidence with curiosity. We had been briefed that the American 4-engine bomber was large and slow, maximum speed perhaps 280 kilometers per hour at altitude. Our Zeros could exceed 530 kilometers. We believed we could attack from any angle with impunity, maintain position alongside the bomber whilst firing, then break away before defensive guns could track us effectively. The mathematics seemed to favor the attackers. A Zero could close from 1,000 yards to firing range, roughly 200 yards, in approximately 12 seconds at attack speed. The B-17's defensive gunners would have perhaps 8 seconds to acquire, track, and fire at a rapidly closing fighter. Japanese pilots calculated they could make multiple attack passes, absorbing minimal risk whilst inflicting cumulative damage that would eventually down the bomber. These calculations worked perfectly against most Allied aircraft they'd encountered thus far. The B-17's 4 Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower, gave it a maximum speed of 287 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, respectable for a bomber but glacial compared to fighters. The service ceiling of 35,000 feet offered some protection, as early war Japanese fighters struggled above 30,000 feet. But most combat occurred at 20,000 to 25,000 feet where Zeros performed excellently. The bomber's size, 74 feet long with a 103-foot wingspan, meant it couldn't maneuver aggressively without risking structural damage or stalling. Every tactical assessment suggested the B-17 would be vulnerable to coordinated fighter attacks. Captain Kelly's B-17C on December 10th carried a crew that had been in the Philippines for barely 3 months. Their gunnery training consisted primarily of ground school and limited live-fire exercises against towed targets. The actual experience of tracking a fighter closing at 300 plus mph whilst operating in oxygen masks at altitude whilst the aircraft bounced in turbulence. This was theory meeting practice for the first time. When Sakai's flight engaged Kelly's B-17, the Japanese aces learned their first harsh lesson about American defensive firepower. The .50 caliber Browning M2 machine gun wasn't the largest aerial weapon in the war, but it possessed characteristics that made it uniquely lethal in bomber defense. Each gun fired 750 to 850 rounds per minute with an effective range of 1,000 yards. The half-inch diameter bullets weighed 1.7 ounces and left the barrel at 2,900 feet per second, velocity sufficient to punch through aircraft skin, shatter engine blocks, and sever control cables from ranges where lighter weapons lost effectiveness. Japanese fighters mounted predominantly 7.7mm machine guns with 20mm cannons reserved for elite units. The 7.7mm rounds, roughly .30 caliber, required multiple hits to inflict serious damage on structures. The B-17's .50 caliber rounds didn't require multiple hits. A single round striking a Zero's wing spar could compromise structural integrity. A burst into the engine would often result in immediate failure. Hits to the pilot, unprotected by armor in early Zeros, were almost always fatal. The psychological difference between being shot at with .30 caliber versus .50 caliber was profound. One felt like being pelted, the other like being demolished. Sakai's after-action report, preserved in Japanese naval archives, described the encounter with unusual candor for a pilot who would later become famous for claiming 64 victories. I approached from the port quarter standard attack position. The bomber's guns opened fire at perhaps 400 meters. I saw the tracers, every fifth round illuminated, and they appeared to move slowly, almost lazily. This was deceptive. By the time my mind registered their position, they had already passed or were striking my aircraft. I felt impacts on my left wing and fuselage. The Zero shuddered. I broke off the attack immediately. The impacts Sakai felt were .50 caliber rounds from the B-17's waist gunner, Staff Sergeant Meyer Levin. Post-war analysis of Sakai's combat reports suggests his Zero took at least 3 hits during that brief engagement. 2 in the wing and 1 that penetrated the fuselage near the cockpit. Any one of those hits could have been fatal with slightly different impact angles. Sakai survived, but his Zero required extensive repairs. More importantly, his respect for the B-17's defensive capabilities transformed instantly from theoretical to visceral. The defensive fire pattern created by even a single B-17 was more complex than Japanese pilots anticipated. The 5-gun positions didn't operate independently. They created overlapping fields of fire that covered most approach angles. An attacking fighter couldn't simply slip between defensive guns because the coverage zones intersected. The top turret gunner covered high approaches. The ball turret handled low angles. The waist gunners addressed beam attacks. The tail gunner protected the stern. Only direct nose and direct tail approaches offered any reduction in defensive fire, and even those remained covered by single guns. Captain Kelly's B-17 was eventually shot down that day, but not by Sakai. Another Zero pilot, making a desperate frontal pass, collided with the bomber rather than successfully shooting it down. Kelly and most of his crew died when the B-17 crashed. The loss was tragic, but the tactical lessons embedded in that engagement rippled through both air forces. Japanese pilots reported their encounters with B-17s to intelligence officers who compiled tactical assessments throughout December 1941 and early 1942. These reports reveal a pattern of increasing respect mixed with frustration. Lieutenant Nakao's report from a December 22nd engagement noted, "The 4-engine bomber absorbs damage that would destroy 2 medium bombers. We observed strikes from 20mm cannon fire that appeared to penetrate the fuselage with no immediate effect. The aircraft continued formation flying, maintained altitude, and completed its bombing run before returning to base." This durability factor surprised Japanese tacticians who'd grown accustomed to bombers that fell apart under sustained attack. The B-17 structure used a semi-monocoque design where the aluminum skin carried significant structural loads, reinforced by internal stringers and formers. This meant damage to one section didn't compromise the entire airframe. A Zero could shoot holes through a wing, and the B-17 would continue flying. Puncture the fuselage, and only that specific area lost pressurization. The redundancy was infuriating to pilots expending precious ammunition without achieving kills. By early 1942, American forces had withdrawn most surviving B-17s to Australia, regrouping for eventual counterattacks. During this lull, Boeing engineers were frantically addressing the defensive weaknesses that December's combat had exposed. The B-17E model, entering service in September 1941, represented the first serious attempt to create the fortress the name promised. The gun armament increased dramatically from 5 to 9.50 caliber positions, 2 waist guns instead of 1, a new tail position with twin .50 calibers, a ball turret underneath mounting 2 more .50s. The new nose configuration added guns to cover frontal approaches. The tail position deserves special attention because it became the deadliest defensive station on the B-17. The tail gunner sat in an isolated position, separated from the rest of the crew, squeezed into a space measuring roughly 4 feet by 3 feet. He operated twin .50 caliber machine guns with 500 rounds per gun. His field of view covered approximately 90 degrees vertically and horizontally, perfect for engaging fighters attacking from the stern, the most common Japanese approach angle. Tail gunners would eventually account for roughly 50% of all air-to-air kills credited to B-17 defensive fire. Staff Sergeant Benjamin Warner, a tail gunner with the 43rd Bomb Group operating from Australia in mid-1942, described the psychological aspects of his position. "You're alone back there. The rest of the crew is forward. You can't see them, can't talk to them except through intercom. When fighters attack, they're coming directly at you. You watch them grow from specks to full-size aircraft in seconds. Your job is to track them, lead them properly, and fire before they fire. If you miss, their rounds come straight into your position. There's no armor behind you, just sky." The ball turret represented another innovation that Japanese pilots learned to hate. Suspended beneath the fuselage in a rotating sphere, the ball turret gunner had an unobstructed view of the lower hemisphere. The position was claustrophobic. Gunners had to be small to fit, typically under 5 feet 6 inches and 150 pounds. But the defensive coverage was revolutionary. Japanese fighters attempting attacks from below, a tactic that worked against earlier bombers, now faced concentrated fire from a position specifically designed to counter that approach. The B-17F and G models, which became the most numerous variants with over 8,600 produced, represented the final evolution of defensive armament. 13.50 caliber machine guns, 2 in the nose, 2 in the top turret, 2 in the ball turret, 2 at each waist position, 1 in the radio compartment, and 2 in the tail. Each aircraft carried approximately 6,380 rounds of ammunition distributed across these positions. When all guns fired simultaneously, rare but possible, a single B-17 could put out 9,750 rounds per minute. That's 162 half-inch bullets every second, creating a cone of steel around the aircraft. Japanese fighter pilots encountering these later models experienced a dramatic escalation in danger. Flight Petty Officer Saburō Sakai, recovered from his earlier wounds and returned to combat, faced B-17Fs over the Solomon Islands in 1943. His memoir, Samurai, includes a telling passage. Attacking the new model was suicide unless you had perfect positioning and could strike vitals immediately. The number of guns had increased so dramatically that approach from any angle meant flying through defensive fire. We learned to attack only when we had altitude advantage and sun behind us, and even then only in coordinated groups where multiple fighters could saturate defensive gunners. The combat box formation amplified individual aircraft firepower into something genuinely terrifying. American tacticians had developed the box formation specifically to create overlapping defensive fires between aircraft. A standard box consisted of 18 to 21 B-17s arranged in staggered altitude layers, high squadron, middle squadron, and low squadron. Each aircraft's defensive guns covered portions of neighboring aircraft. The result was that attacking fighters didn't face one B-17's 13 guns. They faced concentrated fire from 4 to 6 aircraft simultaneously, potentially 50 to 75 machine guns tracking a single target. Japanese attack doctrine emphasized individual initiative and flexibility, which worked well against isolated bombers but failed catastrophically against combat boxes. Lieutenant Yasuhiko Kuro, flying with the 11th Air Fleet over New Guinea, described the tactical dilemma. You cannot attack the formation from outside without flying through defensive fire zones. You cannot penetrate the formation without exposing yourself to multiple aircraft. The Americans have created a formation where the whole is far more deadly than the sum of its parts. The Battle of Bismarck Sea in March 1943 demonstrated the maturation of B-17 defensive tactics in the Pacific theater. American bombers attacked a Japanese convoy attempting to reinforce New Guinea, flying at medium altitude in tight formation. 0 fighters from Rabaul rose to intercept, and the resulting air battle saw Japanese pilots attempting every attack angle they developed. Head-on passes to avoid tail gunners, high-side attacks diving through the formation, low-altitude approaches from below. Every method encountered devastating defensive fire. Flight Petty Officer Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, one of Japan's top aces with over 80 claimed victories, participated in the Bismarck Sea air battles. His combat report noted, "We destroyed 3 bombers but lost 8 fighters in the engagement. The exchange ratio is unsustainable. The American bombers fly in such tight formation that separating one from the group is nearly impossible. When we damage one aircraft, others in formation protect it with their defensive fire whilst it withdraws." The structural durability of the B-17 created a secondary psychological effect that amplified Japanese pilot frustration. Fighters would make what appeared to be successful attacks, observing strikes, seeing pieces fly off, sometimes even setting engines ablaze, only to watch the bomber continue flying. Staff Sergeant Michael Sullivan, a waist gunner with the 5th Bomb Group, recalled, "We took hits from a Zero's 20mm cannon that punched holes through both sides of the fuselage. You could see daylight through the holes. Our tail gunner was wounded. Number 3 engine was smoking. But the pilot kept formation, completed the bomb run, and flew us back to base. The Japanese must have thought we were indestructible. This perception wasn't entirely wrong." The B-17's redundant systems meant that catastrophic failures required simultaneous destruction of multiple critical components. For engines meant losing 1, even 2 still left sufficient power for controlled flight. Dual hydraulic systems ensured that control surface actuation remained possible even with significant damage. The flight controls used cable systems rather than hydraulic assists, so pilots could physically maneuver the aircraft even when engines failed and electrical systems died. Japanese fighters, by contrast, were designed for performance over survivability. A single 20mm hit in the right location often proved fatal. The oxygen system represented another critical advantage that Japanese pilots envied. B-17s operated routinely at 25,000 to 30,000 feet, where the thin air degraded fighter performance whilst keeping bombers above most anti-aircraft fire. The crew oxygen system allowed sustained operations at these altitudes. Japanese fighters could reach these heights, but performance degraded significantly and pilots couldn't maintain combat effectiveness for extended periods without proper oxygen systems. American bomber crews could fight effectively at altitude for 8 to 10-hour missions. Japanese interceptors had perhaps 30 to 45 minutes of effective combat time before fuel or oxygen limitations forced withdrawal. The defensive gunnery training American crews received improved dramatically as the war progressed. Early war gunners often fired without proper lead calculation, wasting ammunition. By 1943, gunners trained with sophisticated techniques including deflection shooting, calculating where a crossing target would be rather than where it appeared, and range estimation using calibrated reticles. Gunnery schools in the United States put crews through intensive training that included firing at towed targets from moving aircraft, simulating the complexity of actual combat. Japanese fighter tactics evolved in response to B-17 defensive capabilities, but these adaptations revealed the depth of respect the Flying Fortress had earned. Attack doctrine shifted from individual aggressive passes to coordinated group tactics where 4 to 6 fighters would simultaneously attack different quadrants of a bomber, attempting to saturate defensive gunners. This worked occasionally but required exceptional coordination and exposed multiple fighters to defensive fire simultaneously. The loss rates for such attacks often exceeded 30%, unsustainable given Japan's pilot training pipeline. Some Japanese units developed specialized tactics specifically for B-17s. Frontal attacks, diving from high altitude directly into the bomber's nose, exploited the relatively lighter armament in early models. The nose initially carried only flexible machine guns operated by the bombardier. Later B-17G models addressed this with a chin turret mounting twin .50 calibers, essentially eliminating the frontal vulnerability. Japanese pilots reported that this modification removed the last safe attack angle. The ammunition expenditure statistics from Pacific Theater operations reveal the intensity of defensive engagements. A typical B-17 mission lasting 8 to 10 hours might see each aircraft fire 2,000 to 4,000 rounds across all gun positions when intercepted by fighters. The 43rd Bomb Group's records from operations over Rabaul in late 1943 show several missions where individual aircraft expended over 5,000 rounds, nearly 80% of total capacity. Armorers loading fresh ammunition belts between missions could identify which gunners had been most active by which positions were depleted. The .50 caliber Browning M2's reliability proved crucial to sustain defensive fire. Unlike lighter weapons that overheated quickly, the M2 could fire extended bursts without catastrophic failure. Gunners were trained to fire in 3 to 5 second bursts to preserve barrel life, but in desperate situations, they could sustain fire for 30+ seconds. The guns did jam occasionally, feed malfunctions, broken cartridges, or fouling from spent casings, but the rate was remarkably low given the extreme conditions. Gunners operated at -40 degrees Fahrenheit temperatures, wearing bulky heated suits, breathing through oxygen masks, all while tracking targets moving at 300+ mph. Japanese prisoners of war interrogated about B-17 encounters consistently expressed respect bordering on fear for the bomber's defensive capabilities. A captured Zero pilot from the 582nd Air Group, shot down near Bougainville in November 1943, told interrogators, "We were ordered to attack the 4-engine bombers. 3 of us approached the formation. Only I returned. My wingman exploded from defensive fire before he could launch his attack. My flight leader's aircraft was hit repeatedly and crashed into the sea. I fired all my ammunition and observed strikes on one bomber, but it continued flying. I do not believe these aircraft can be destroyed by fighters alone." This assessment, that B-17s required coordinated attacks combining fighters and anti-aircraft fire, became common in Japanese tactical planning by 1944. The problem was that Japan's defensive resources were stretched increasingly thin. Fighter units were pulled back to defend the home islands. Anti-aircraft batteries protected only the most critical targets. The B-17s, flying in their combat boxes with overlapping defensive fires, increasingly operated with impunity across the Southwest Pacific. The crew coordination required to maximize defensive effectiveness was extraordinary. Pilots maintained tight formation despite turbulence, battle damage, and fear, because breaking formation meant losing the protection of neighboring aircraft's guns. Gunners coordinated their fires through intercom, calling out fighters and avoiding shooting at targets other gunners were already engaging. The bombardier and navigator manned nose guns whilst also managing navigation and targeting. The radio operator split attention between communications and his defensive position. Every crew member except the pilot and co-pilot served dual roles, and even the pilots operated cheek guns in extreme situations. Staff Sergeant Robert Johnson, a top turret gunner with the 90th Bomb Group, described the crew coordination during a November 1943 mission to Rabaul. "We had 15 to 20 fighters attacking for nearly 40 minutes. The intercom was continuous chatter, fighters at 3 o'clock high, fighters at 6 o'clock level, fighters attacking from below. Everyone was firing. Shell casings were piling up in the fuselage. The aircraft shook from our own guns as much as from turbulence. When we finally broke free of the attacks, we'd expended 4,200 rounds and claimed 2 fighters destroyed, 3 probables." The psychological burden on Japanese fighter pilots intensified as the war progressed and B-17 operations became more sophisticated. By mid-1944, American bomber formations included fighter escorts, P-38 Lightnings and later P-51 Mustangs, that dramatically altered the tactical equation. Japanese interceptors now faced a choice: engage the fighters and ignore the bombers, or press through the fighter screen to attack B-17s that would tear them apart with defensive fire. Neither option offered favorable odds. Captured documents from Japanese air units in the Philippines showed pilot morale declining sharply once regular B-17 raids with fighter escort began. The nickname 4-engine beast evolved in Japanese fighter circles from mocking dismissal to genuine description of a feared adversary. Warrant Officer Kinsuke Muto, an instructor pilot at Formosa in late 1944, used the term in training lectures as a warning. The Yon-Hatsu Kemono appears slow and vulnerable, but this is deception. Its defensive armament can destroy your aircraft before you close to effective firing range. Its structure absorbs damage that would destroy any Japanese bomber. You must attack in coordinated groups, targeting specific weak points, or you will die achieving nothing. The kill-to-loss ratio for B-17s versus Japanese fighters in the Pacific theater reflected this defensive effectiveness. Detailed analysis by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey showed that B-17 gunners claimed approximately 2.3 Japanese fighters destroyed per bomber lost to fighter action. While gunner claims were notoriously optimistic, multiple gunners often claimed the same kill. Even conservative estimates suggest ratios approaching 1-to-1. For a bomber being attacked by fighters, achieving parity in exchanges was a remarkable defensive success. Most bombers of the era lost heavily to dedicated fighter attacks. The B-17's operational statistics in the Pacific theater tell the story of a bomber that succeeded despite facing determined opposition. Between 1942 and 1945, Pacific-based B-17s flew over 43,000 sorties, dropped 166,000 tons of bombs, and lost approximately 540 aircraft to all causes, combat, accidents, and operational losses. The loss rate of roughly 1.25% per sortie was sustainable, allowing continuous operations that gradually wore down Japanese defensive capabilities and destroyed strategic targets across the theater. Japanese defensive evolution in response to B-17 raids followed predictable patterns but never solved the fundamental problem. Anti-aircraft batteries increased around critical targets, but hitting bombers at 25,000 plus feet remained difficult. Fighter tactics improved, emphasizing coordinated attacks and targeting engines rather than fuselage, but the losses sustained by attacking fighters remained prohibitive. By 1945, Japanese air commanders in some sectors issued orders to avoid engaging B-17 formations unless absolutely necessary, a tacit admission that the cost of attacking exceeded the value of potential kills. The final Pacific B-17 missions in August 1945 faced minimal opposition, not because Japanese defenses had been withdrawn, but because they'd been destroyed by the cumulative attrition of 3 years of combat. The four-engine beast that Japanese pilots had initially mocked in 1941 had outlasted most of the pilots who'd attacked it. The survivors remembered their encounters with the Flying Fortress not as victories but as lessons in American industrial capacity and the lethal effectiveness of defensive firepower properly employed. The B-17's legacy in the Pacific theater extended beyond operational statistics into the realm of psychological warfare and strategic exhaustion. Japanese defensive planning throughout 1943 to 1945 had to account for the possibility of B-17 raids against any target within range. This forced dispersal of fighter units, anti-aircraft batteries, and radar stations across thousands of miles of territory, resources that might have been concentrated more effectively if American bombers had been less capable. The Flying Fortress didn't just destroy targets through bombing. It consumed Japanese defensive resources through its mere existence. Post-war interviews with Japanese aviation commanders revealed a consistent theme: respect for American bomber defensive capabilities that bordered on admiration. General Minoru Genda, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, told American interrogators in 1945, "Your heavy bombers represented a category of warfare we had not adequately prepared for. Our fighters were designed for dogfighting and air superiority missions. We had not anticipated that bombers would be so heavily armed that attacking them became nearly suicidal. The defensive firepower of your formations forced us to develop entirely new tactics, and even those tactics rarely proved effective." The individual stories of B-17 crews in the Pacific deserve recognition beyond tactical analysis. These men flew 8 to 10-hour missions over hostile territory, faced determined fighter attacks, endured anti-aircraft fire, dealt with mechanical failures and weather, all while knowing that ditching in the Pacific meant probable death from exposure, sharks, or Japanese capture. The psychological resilience required to climb into a B-17 for mission after mission, watching other crews fail to return, cannot be overstated. The aircraft's defensive capabilities provided some confidence, but ultimately, survival depended on skill, luck, and collective courage. Staff Sergeant Warner, the tail gunner, survived 35 missions and later reflected, "The B-17 saved my life multiple times. The defensive guns gave us a fighting chance when attacked. The structure held together when we took damage that should have been fatal. But what really mattered was the crew. 10 men working together, covering each other, staying focused when everything around them was exploding. The aircraft was just metal and engines. The crew made it a fortress. The technical evolution of the B-17 from the lightly armed B model through the heavily defended G model represented rapid adaptation to combat realities. American engineers had responded to battlefield feedback with unprecedented speed, adding guns, improving armor, refining tactics. This iterative improvement based on combat experience gave the B-17 defensive capabilities that were literally unimaginable when the aircraft was first designed in 1935. The Flying Fortress name had been marketing hyperbole in 1935. By 1944, it was accurate description. Japanese fighter pilots who survived the war and later wrote memoirs consistently mentioned B-17 encounters as among their most difficult and dangerous missions. Saburō Sakai, Japan's third highest scoring ace, devoted an entire chapter of his memoir to American bomber defensive tactics, describing them as the most formidable challenge a fighter pilot faced. Coming from a pilot credited with 64 victories, this assessment carries weight. The B-17 had earned respect from adversaries who were not easily impressed. The Flying Fortress demonstrated a fundamental truth about military aviation that remains relevant. Defensive capabilities matter as much as offensive power. A bomber that can't reach its target and return is simply an expensive way to kill your own crews. A bomber that can fight through opposition, deliver ordnance accurately, and bring crews home to fly again is a strategic weapon. The B-17 achieved this balance through brute force, massive defensive armament, redundant systems, structural strength that absorbed punishment. It wasn't elegant. It was effective. The final irony of the four-engine beast nickname lies in its accuracy. Japanese pilots had chosen the term mockingly, emphasizing the B-17's size and ungainliness. But beasts are dangerous precisely because they're difficult to kill. They absorb damage that would destroy lesser creatures. They fight back with primal ferocity. They inspire fear in predators who learn that attacking comes at terrible cost. The B-17 was indeed a beast, slow, heavy, inelegant. But it was also survivable, deadly, and ultimately victorious. The last operational B-17 mission in the Pacific occurred on August 14, 1945, the day before Japan's surrender. The bomber crews returned to base without incident, their mission complete not just for that day but for the entire war. The four-engine beast that Japanese pilots had initially dismissed had helped reduce their empire to ruins. The Flying Fortress that seemed too big, too slow, too vulnerable had proven that size could be strength, that firepower could create safety, and that good enough defensive capabilities properly employed could defeat tactical brilliance. Sometimes the beast wins. Sometimes the fortress holds. Sometimes 13 machine guns are exactly enough to transform a bomber into a legend. The B-17 Flying Fortress earned its name through 4 years of combat where it proved that the best offense is sometimes an overwhelming defense. Japanese pilots learned this lesson the hard way, one attack pass at a time, until the survivors stopped attacking altogether.